So, Alex, where are you right now?
I'm in the Scottish borders, actually, about 50 miles south of Edinburgh, so sufficiently close to Westminster to have some clue as to what's going on there, but hopefully sufficiently distant from it to have some immunity from the pack fever that tends to swirl around the Westminster village. At least that's the theory.
That's the theory. And it is a very small village, isn't it? The more we read this, the coverage of this scandal, the more you realize. I think I saw someone tweet yesterday, there are only 300 people in the UK.
That may be an exaggeration. In terms of who counts, I think in terms of the Westminster Fleet Street nexus, it's probably rather fewer than that, actually. It's perhaps 100.
Now, one of these people who counts in various different ways, he's a good friend of Rebekah Brooks, and he used to be deep in the PR world, knows all of the journalists in London, somehow managed to get elected leader of the Tory party and is now Prime Minister, is David Cameron. An interesting career there, and he's squirming right now, isn't he?
He is. One of the extraordinary things about this, Cameron is very interesting. He has a pattern of sort of sailing through life. Everything looks as though it's going terribly smoothly, swimmingly well, in fact. And then something happens and he loses his grip and he looks a little out of touch. And people wonder, is there very much to this man after all? What is he about? Does he have any command of the situation? And then, when a crisis is upon him, he reacts to it and pulls it out of the bag. I mean, he's rather like one of those bright kids at school or university who didn't attend lectures very often, never seemed to be doing any work, and then pulled an all-nighter in the library the night before an exam and sails through with at least an upper second and perhaps a low first. And that was rather, I think, how he performed this morning in the House of Commons, where he was questioned by MPs for a couple of hours. I think he answered 136 questions from members of Parliament, some of them friendly, of course, from pliant Tory backbenchers, but others rather more hostile or probing from the opposition. And, he did his best to at long last, actually, be in control of this situation, be on the front foot, if you like, to use a cricketing term. That after a couple of weeks where Cameron seemed to be responding to events, this was the moment where he said, well, I am Prime Minister. The clock stopped on my watch, was how he put it. And so it forced him to clear up this mess, which, implicates all political parties and all newspapers, not just the News of the World and the other parts of the Murdoch empire. And Cameron was in control this morning on the whole. I mean, there are still a couple of issues that could come back to trouble him. But the notion a couple of days ago that Cameron could be destroyed by this, that moment seems to have passed. His recognition that in hindsight perhaps it wasn't a great idea to hire Andy Coulson, the former editor of the News of the World, as his communications director was in one sense blindingly obvious, but on the other not always the sort of frank admission that you don't always get from politicians. So for the first time, Cameron looked like Prime Minister today, whereas in the past he's been posted missing for much of this crisis.
And this is quite unusual in terms of what we've been seeing coming out of Parliament over the past couple of days, because Rupert Murdoch certainly didn't look like a global media magnate in control of anything really much. He looked like an old man, and his son James just kept on telling everyone about how little he knew and how nobody told him anything, and that he was blindingly ignorant of everything all along. So, and Rebekah Brooks, frankly, made both of them look good. So.
Yes. I mean, it's curious approach to crisis management. We didn't know, but obviously you should continue to trust us to run our global company, which I would have thought might raise some issues of corporate governance that might interest some shareholders in New York.
But clearly the shareholders don't believe it. And I don't think anyone in Parliament really believed it either, did they?
No, No. But on the other hand, what else were they supposed to say? They were supposed to say, yes, we knew all about it and we gave our approval, our enthusiastic approval for it all. I mean, in one sense, Murdoch's thing of, I'm not really in touch, well, on the surface, preposterous, obviously, because he has a reputation as a micromanager, and, he said, I work 10, 12 hours a day, even though I'm 80. In one sense, it's reasonable enough in as much as in the 1980s, when his British newspapers were a much larger part of his overall media portfolio, he was much more in touch with editors, not just the chief executive of News International, but actual editors on a daily and weekly basis. These days, now that his interests are so much larger in the United States and in Italy and in television, he's probably not quite as in touch with the day-to-day affairs of his newspapers as he once was. But, nevertheless, the notion that News of the World is just 1% of our holdings, and therefore we can't be expected to have much of a clue about what's going on there, is pretty risible.
And James in particular, this question came up in many different forms, and he managed to sort of duck it in many different forms. But one of the key lines of questioning yesterday was the fact that he paid Graham Taylor, what was it, £700,000
Yes.
on the grounds that he was bound to lose this court case and it would be cheaper to just settle. But somehow, despite the fact that he was advised that he was bound to lose the court case, he managed to remain studiously ignorant of why he was bound to lose the court case.
Yes, plausible deniability, I suppose, or something. And the other extraordinary aspect of that was that Rupert didn't know, or claimed not to know, that his company had shelled out, £600,000 or £700,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Which seems quite extraordinary. I mean, even
the word that James kept on using was quantum of finance, which it sounds like a really bad James Bond movie. The quantum of finance is so small. When you're as rich as Rupert Murdoch, £1 million here, £1 million there. Who really cares?
Yeah, I mean, James speaks an extraordinary language. His accent is all over the place. There's a little bit of the Antipodes, there's a lot of it in the United States, and a little bit of Britain in it. And he seemed determined to smother parliamentary committee in vast quantities of soft corporate gobbledygook, the meaning of which, frankly, escaped me and I suspect most other observers. But you're the finance guy, so perhaps you understood what he was talking about. Yeah,
well, I understood perfectly that he would answer questions with such long words and at such great length, but by the time he finished talking, you'd completely forgotten what the question was.
Yes, and since the question was, did you know what was going on? This is something that might invite a yes or no answer in other settings. But of course, one also had the impression that James was quite keen to talk out the clock as much as possible and shield his father from the more aggressive or pointed questions.
So this is one interesting question I have here, because this is where my knowledge of the UK Parliament sort of fails me a little. I have two questions. The first one is, why did they allow James and Rupert to sit next to each other and thereby help insulate Rupert with James? I mean, they had Rebecca on separately. If they'd had James and Rupert on individually rather than together, wouldn't that have helped focus certainly the questioning of Rupert and really made it clear what was going on with him?
Yes, I think that was partly a time issue, to be honest. Because initially there'd been some talk that Brooks would appear with the Murdochs as well, but splitting it up into 3 separate sessions might have run into time problems. I assume. I think that's part of it, or possibly.
And would it make sense to do?
It's possible that the Murdochs said, "Well, we'll do it if we can sit together. Safety in numbers." That.
Now they did say initially that they weren't going to turn up, and then they sort of changed their mind and said that they would turn up. One of the many U-turns that we've seen from Murdoch, including saying that Rebecca Brooks, of course, was not going to resign before she resigned. Now they're saying that neither of the Murdochs are going to resign, and their jobs are safe. Do we believe that?
Well, I mean, yes, on the issue of them appearing or their initial thing, well, of course, we're not going to appear before a mere parliamentary inquiry. I mean, who on earth do you think we are? Eventually it twigged on them, I think, that when people are a little concerned about the power and influence of an overmighty press baron, it is not the best idea to strut around the place as an overmighty, overpowerful press baron, unaccountable to anybody and disdainful of Parliament and indeed everything else, including public opinion. So that I think it forced their hand, and eventually they realised that it might be a good idea to turn up and stall and answer, pretend to answer a few questions.
I love the report that I read yesterday about how Rupert thought it might be a good idea. He phoned up one of his PR advisors and said, "Do you think that maybe I should fly commercial to England? Would that help?"
Media organisations, though, are always terrible at crisis management. Any time anything blows up about a newspaper, regardless of whether it's in the United Kingdom or the United States and so on, journalists and media people are absolutely hopeless at actually putting a decent case for themselves without looking completely out of touch and ridiculous. I think that's just a general rule that for people in the communications business, or one aspect of it, and so on, they're actually quite hopeless at defending themselves when they have to. There was
and just to put this in context here, David Cameron used to be a communications guy for a media company, right?
Yes, yeah. Cameron worked in PR and corporate strategy, or whatever that is, for Carlton, an independent and terrible television company in the United Kingdom, specialising in just awful programmes that nobody watched, and I can't even remember if it still exists or not. There was a magnificent moment yesterday when Rupert said, "Well, when I said that Rebecca Brooks was my priority, I basically just got out of bed and opened the front door and stepped outside, and
I had lots of microphones in my face.
Reporters there stuffing microphones in my face and so on, and I got a little flustered, and you shouldn't really be putting an old man under pressure of that sort. It's outrageous behaviour to doorstep people in this manner. What are you people thinking? It was quite priceless. There were flickers, in his appearance of the old brute has still got it, if you like.
But not when he apologised for headlines which would ever give offence. We would never intentionally offend someone in a headline.
No, not in a headline. No. The 400 words that follow it, but not in the headline. After all, most of our readers can only read the headlines.
But the other question I had is, about British Parliament. This is meant to be the mother of parliaments, the home of prime ministers' questions, the home of great debates and, cut and parry and great, legal debating minds being able to cut through obfuscation. And frankly, we didn't see much of that, did we?
Well,
the MPs.
First, it's England that is the mother of parliaments, not Westminster that is the mother of parliaments. And one should also probably point out that that Iceland, not without its own troubles lately, of course, has a parliament that's probably older than any of the others, and is perhaps, if you like, the grandmother of parliaments. But as for the MPs, I thought it was the usual mixed bag. On the one hand, there was much less of the preening self-regard that one witnesses at a Senate or House of Representatives committee. Thank God we were spared 15-minute opening statements from each member of the panel of the committee. And there were actually questions asked. I remember watching a magnificent display by Joe Biden, who admittedly may be considered the expert of all experts in this manner, in this thing and so on, in which he was questioning somebody for 30 minutes and asked one question that was interrupted essentially by two 15-minute Biden monologues. It was absolutely magnificent. In this instance, there were at least questions asked, and I thought 3 or 4 of the MPs did quite a good job. There were a couple who were, as to be expected, hopeless. But it's also important to remember that these committee hearings are only part of the sort of multi-stranded investigation that's going on. The parliamentary committee will issue its own report, and they will obviously want to be sort of cross-referencing what was said to them yesterday with written submissions, further hearings, and paper trail, if you like. But there's also the judicial inquiry into abuses in the newspaper industry and abusive connections between the newspapers and the Metropolitan Police. Everybody has lost count, but there are now 6 or 7 different investigations going ahead into all of this. And so,
and how many of these
looking for a big bang moment, and is probably not the way to view it. It's a long-standing, piecemeal, painstaking investigation that 6 or 7 different parties will report, and from that eventually there'll be an overall conclusion. But it's also the case that everybody wants to move on in many ways. All political parties are implicated. All newspapers, to one degree or another, are implicated in, at the very least, purchasing information from private agencies, private detectives, and not really caring to inquire exactly how that.
There was one point in the hearing, wasn't there, where Rupert came out and said, "Well, everybody does it. All news organisations employ private detectives." And I was like, "Wow, I must be unbelievably sheltered and naive because I've."
Yes, but you're in New York, aren't you? And, and Reuters, of course, fine, upstanding, ancient institution, and so on, is a slightly different kettle of fish. Operation Motorman, which was a previous police investigation into all of this, found that, every newspaper group on Fleet Street, including The Guardian and The Observer Group, had purchased information from private detectives without caring to ask too much, too deeply about where that information or how that information was acquired. Quite a number of these abuses have been tightened up or eliminated subsequently, but not all of them, clearly. For a long time, everybody on Fleet Street knew that this was going on, but just pretended not to, and thought, well, it's just the way it goes. It's the price of doing business. In that respect, I sort of think it's a little like professional cycling, where everybody knew, again, for years, that the peloton was a sort of pharmacy on wheels, but preferred to ignore the fact. Now, when the scandal erupts and sunshine intrudes upon it all, you can no longer pretend that you didn't know, even though you did know, and so you have to pretend to be shocked by what is going on. But at the same time, things can't go back to being exactly how they were before. You either accept this is the way it's been and always will be, or you make efforts to, over a number of years and a period of time, clean things up. And something similar, I think, is happening at Westminster and on Fleet Street and indeed with the police, that we can no longer pretend that we didn't know. And at the same time, therefore, it is very important that we pretend to be utterly shocked by the depravity which we long suspected, secretly rather enjoyed, because we wanted to read the newspapers. We wanted to. The public's appetite for celebrity trivia and intrusive journalism and so on has been a wonder to behold, matched only by the hypocrisy of the public's distaste for it when those methods are revealed.
One of the things which strikes me is that this whole thing has been sort of eclipsed by technology. That the phone hacking, the sort of really the high watermark of phone hacking, if you will, was sort of 2000 to 2005, 2006, something like that.
Yeah.
Which is when people, first started. Where it was like that brief period when you had ubiquitous mobile phones. And we hadn't yet just completely moved on to sort of texting and email and Twitter and stuff as the way that we communicate with each other.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody leaves voicemails anymore. If you hacked into my voicemail, you would not get anything.
If you're a public figure.
Because, well, but literally, when was the last time anybody left you any private information on a voicemail?
When was the last time I listened to voicemail?
Exactly.
The number of people who listen to a voicemail message saying "Don't leave me a voicemail" and then continue to leave a voicemail and so on is remarkable, and suggests I should have more intelligent friends or something who are better at hearing. But yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, again, actually, I would draw the comparison with cycling. That, one of the problems was that the drugs got too good, and it was no longer a question of people taking drugs just to survive the Tour de France, but also taking stuff that would enable them to win it. Similarly, with a lot of these dark arts, as they were known on Fleet Street and so on, a little bit of low-level corruption, if you like, 50 quid in a carry-up in a brown paper bag, and to a policeman for providing you a tip-off is one thing. It's shabby and shady, but it's the sort of low-level thing that's always been going on. But when you're talking about a system-wide, highly technical, quasi-professional private intelligence service, which is essentially what was happening, then it's on a different level, and it's the sort of thing that you can't actually ignore forever. And some of the regulations have been tightened up. I mean, phone hacking didn't used to be a crime, as you suggest. Legislation hadn't actually caught up with technological change. Now, as you say, nobody leaves voicemail, so I mean, it'd be rather harder to sustain these these dark arts, even if they were actually legal and not the subject of a certain measure.
We'll just hack into email instead. But which by the way, Rupert Murdoch, I don't know if you've been following this, has been accused of doing in the US. Not interestingly at his news outlets, Fox News or New York Post or the Wall Street Journal, but rather at this rather obscure but very large company called News America, which publishes these little supermarket coupon flyers.
Right.
And apparently they were hacking into, or allegedly hacking into the computers of their competitors, and wound up having to pay well over $500 million in various out-of-court settlements to make all of those problems go away. So I think that's like the next, it used to be voicemails, and next I think it's maybe going to be computers. But the voicemail thing isn't over, and one of the questions which I have for you is like, whether and when all of this is going to spill over to the rest of the press. When's it going to hit the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail and everybody else who was, it was not confined to the news of the world, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, the Daily Mail, it's interesting. I mean, there's always been this sort of honour amongst thieves aspect of, proprietors doing deals with one another to make sure that, that they aren't attacked themselves and their own, their business interests are protected. These things are as old as newspapers. But yes, I mean, it's also noticeable that the Daily Mail has started saying, enough is enough of this little Westminster village story. Let's concentrate on the things that really matter, which is in one sense, I think, part of an increasing public mood that, the spectacle of journalists talking about journalists and politicians talking about politicians and so on is rarely an edifying one. And it's the sort of incestuous little world that eventually the public feels, actually they would like to talk about something else. But yeah, because all newspapers, are guilty to one degree or another, I think eventually there will be a sort of drawing of the line and an unofficial amnesty. I mean, obviously a few people are going to have to go to jail, but on the whole, I think there'll be this sort of collective amnesty that politicians and the newspapers will agree upon, just because otherwise, where the hell does the whole thing end?
Well, so from a US perspective, the person everyone's kind of looking at over here is our beloved Piers Morgan, who's now got this
very Piers Morgan, as Private Eye calls him.
Very, very high-profile talk show on CNN. He's the new Larry King.
Yes, I mean, really, is that a title anyone should want to aspire to?
And he's getting paid a lot of money. But the question is, as raised in Parliament yesterday, did he get his scoop of the year about Sven-Goran Eriksson and Ulrika Jonsson by tapping into one or the other one's phone?
There's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence, shall we say, or at least, yes, I mean, I would be surprised if he didn't, shall we say? But I mean, I have no way of knowing.
He is coming out very, very aggressively now. Like, he's been quite quiet about this whole thing, but ever since this allegation got aired yesterday, he's been quite aggressively saying, no, there was no phone hacking involved. I never published a story based on phone hacking. And he's doing the denial and bluster thing, probably because journalistic standards, I hate to say it, are actually higher in the US than they are in the UK. And if he admitted to using phone hacking to publish his scoop, then he would immediately get fired by CNN.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, journalistic standards are higher in the United States than in the UK, but which is one reason, I suppose, why CNN is unwatchable. It doesn't actually bring you any news. It's a talk show. But yes, there will be very few people weeping if Piers Morgan, in the United Kingdom, very few people will be desperately saddened if Piers Morgan is caught up in this. And I think very few people would be surprised if he were. Given the time that he was at the News of the World and the Daily Mirror, it stretches a degree of credulity, I think, to think that he had no knowledge of any of this stuff happening.
So one thing,
if he's disgraced, it couldn't happen to a nicer fellow, could it?
Well, one thing which Piers Morgan has in common with Rebecca Brooks is not only that they were both editor of the News of the World, but that they were both appointed editor of the News of the World when they were in their 20s.
It's the fetish for youth.
The fetish for youth. It seems to me indicative of a desire by Rupert Murdoch not to install someone at News of the World who had the wisdom of many years' experience, but rather someone who was a bit more tractable and who could mold.
Rupert's always been editors who get too big for their boots, editors who get too independent, editors who actually become high-profile public figures in their own right, or at least as a result of their position within his empire, tend not to last very much longer. Andrew Neil is one example of that. Andrew's career at News Corp was damaged essentially by him being too big a figure, too big a personality himself. And so, appointing young editors is one way of ensuring that they're fairly beholden to you and don't have a sort of 40-year career of independent journalism to fall back on in terms of their judgment and all the rest of it, and their relationship with the proprietor. But it's also a factor of the intensely competitive aspect of British newspaper market. That because in each sector of the market you have multiple papers competing for the same batch of readers, and everybody's been terribly concerned by the fact that newspaper readers are getting older, and so therefore any editor who can plausibly say, well, I know what the young people are wanting these days, which is always an absolute lie, because it turns out the young people don't want a newspaper. Is an attractive proposition for newspaper owners who are desperate to find the readers of the future, if you like. And there's this notion that the whippersnappers are the way to do it, but it's not one that's been borne out by events.
So tell me about the future of the tabloid press now that the News of the World is no longer. James and Rupert Murdoch both said they had no plans to launch the Sun on Sunday, which I don't think anybody believed that either.
No.
And
I've not met anyone who believes that.
and I just saw that I've got a friend, Alexander Lebedev, has been talking about doing some kind of Sunday tabloid as well.
Because obviously the answer to the problem of billionaire Australian Americans owning newspapers is to have the newspapers owned by billionaire Russians, or dubious
vast improvement
themselves. Newspaper proprietors have always been a pretty dodgy bunch. Northcliffe launched a war against Asquith in the First World War, and Baldwin must go was the great rallying call in the 1930s, which led to his famous observation that the press demanded power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot through the ages, which is absolutely fine because newspapers are quite happy to embrace their harlot status, whereas it's a sort of badge of shabby pride.
Well, UK newspapers, it's actually interestingly not the case with US newspapers, who are terribly big on being like members of the fourth estate and terribly important and constitutionally protected and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be the other way around. If you go back to the turn of the century, the heyday of American yellow journalism, it was British newspapers complained about how vulgar and tenacious and without scruple the American press were, whereas some of those American papers viewed the British press as being hopelessly enthralled to the establishment and keen to lead a comfortable and easy life.
And was it Rupert Murdoch who single-handedly changed that?
Single-handedly, I think, is probably putting it a little strongly. I mean, Murdoch didn't arrive in the United Kingdom until 1968 when he bought the News of the World, which was his first newspaper in the UK, and then then he launched the Sun shortly afterwards. Single-handedly, I mean, the novelist Will Self was on BBC Newsnight last night, where preposterously he said that Murdoch introduced envy to the United Kingdom, which was a remarkable statement. Even if you are generous to Mr. Self, which one is not tempted to be, but if one is generous to him, then you'd say a culture of envy. But really, no. I mean, I think it's more a product of cultural changes. The deference, if you like, was in decline before Murdoch arrived in the UK. It was a feature of the 1960s. And subsequently through the 70s and 80s. I mean, Murdoch has obviously had an impact on the culture, but he's also done good things. I mean, it was Murdoch who defeated the tyranny of the print unions, who essentially had a veto over what could and couldn't be published in British newspapers. It was Murdoch who essentially created a satellite television industry in the United Kingdom. Many of the people calling for his empire to be dismantled or broken up or its wings to be clipped one way or another and so on are quite happy for the BBC to sail on as an all-powerful behemoth. And the BBC does a lot of good things, but to pretend that it isn't a hugely powerful part of the British media landscape is absurd. But yet, some people do make that pretense. And in one sense, Murdoch's empire can be seen, if you view it from a sort of 30,000 feet, as a balance to the BBC, which I don't think is necessarily a terrible thing.
So, do you think it stays together? Do you think he manages to keep his three remaining newspapers? He manages to launch a fourth and to keep control of B-Sky-B, or does he actually get his wings clipped?
Well, I mean, he's known crisis before, hasn't he? I mean, I was going to ask you about this. I mean, what's your view of how shareholders are viewing this, and what are they likely to do? I mean, I personally, I think Murdoch's empire will remain largely intact, but whether he's able to pass it on to James or other members, or Elizabeth, is perhaps more in doubt.
So I have this.
What's your view of that?
My view is that he does control the board absolutely, and the board is enthralled to him. So it's almost impossible to imagine that anyone could successfully wrest News Corp from his grasp as long as he's alive. I do think there's a possibility that maybe when the various different police reports come out and investigations are published, that he will quietly cede his CEO position, but not his chairman position, to Chase Carey, who's currently more or less running the company in the US anyway, and who is hugely respected by the financial community and the shareholders, and that because he would still be chairman and he would still control the company, at some point he could engineer handover from Chase Carey to, my guess is Elizabeth. Actually, I have a feeling that she's got this kind of inside track at this point. Well, James is the shield catching all the flack for Rupert in the current fiasco.
She has cleaner hands.
She has much cleaner hands, and she was not in charge of the cover-up. I think that what James has done over the past couple of years in terms of trying to cover up the wrongdoing of the News of the World, it almost worked. I mean, if it literally it was the work of one man, Nick Davies of The Guardian, and if it wasn't for him, like the bluster and payoffs and all the rest of it at News Corp and News International would have worked. But now that they didn't work, now that whole strategy has fallen apart, I find it hard to believe that James is going to be able to take over the whole company.
Yeah, that's clearly. Does Rupert have a preference as to which of his children takes it over? He made a big deal yesterday about how he had inherited this small little scrappy newspaper in Adelaide from his father. Made it quite clear that the succession, I think, is a matter of enormous importance to him. What would he give up, if you like, to ensure the succession to one of his children?
He would dearly love to. I mean, it is clearly the case that he would much rather hand over News Corp to one of his children than anything else. And it's much more important to him than the share price. That's absolute certain. He's a multi-billionaire. He doesn't need the money. What he needs is a legacy, and he wants this company handed over. At one point, it looked like it was going to be to Lachlan. Then he had a big fight with Lachlan, and then it seemed up until very recently that James was very much the heir apparent, and he started talking in very sort of CEO-esque manner about News Corp generally. He's moving to New York, of course, which is the headquarters of News Corp. But yesterday he didn't look like a media mogul. He didn't look like the kind of person who can run a $40 billion, $50 billion company and be in control of stuff. He looked kind of weak, and I don't know, and I have no idea what you're talking about. Nobody tells me anything, and all I do is take my lawyer's advice, and I never ask them why they're saying that. And really, it's the lawyer's fault, and all of this kind of stuff. And while that might have protected him from a legal perspective, it certainly didn't do him any favors from a sort of reputational perspective. And meanwhile, Elizabeth built up her company, Shine TV, into a genuinely successful business, which Rupert bought for, what was it, $618 million, something like that?
Yeah, it's a nice deal if you can get it.
Nice deal if you can get it. But it wasn't, you can argue about whether it was too much, but it wasn't, massively.
It wasn't super outrageous, was it?
And she's, clearly good at running things. And she's also has no hint of taint from the newspapers. She's never really liked the newspapers. She was reported as saying very rude things about not only Rebecca but even James, actually.
Yeah. That's one of the things, isn't it? Rupert, is a newspaper guy who happens to have a lot of television interests now. And of course, in the UK, he's still really viewed as a newspaper man, whereas in the United States, obviously, with the exception of the New York Post and obviously perhaps more importantly the Wall Street Journal, he's really a television guy, isn't he? And the kids are television.
Really? People. It's true. People think of him as Fox, and especially as Fox News. This is the weird thing. He most of his money came from like The Simpsons. It wasn't. But Fox News is the big cash cow. But Fox TV, like the non-news bits, are where the massive money is, and the sports, and of course, 20th Century Fox. The amount of money he made from Avatar is huge. He really is a sort of global media mogul. He owns HarperCollins.
Well, that's why he's been the model for a Bond villain, after all. But yeah, there is a real divide between newspaper and TV people here. In Britain, people don't really. There are some people who care a lot about the B-Sky-P deal, obviously. But the people who are really worried are the journalists on the Times and the Sunday Times who wonder if Rupert were forced to sell the newspapers, who on earth would purchase them on the grounds that These days owning a printing press is a very expensive business. I think they lose about £50 million a year between those papers.
Wow.
And there is a limited number of people who'd be prepared to take on those losses. And those that would be are, as I say, Russian oligarchs or Arab sheikhs of dubious provenance, one way or another. The appetite for owning newspapers is rather smaller than it once was.
I should mention in relation to B-Sky-B that although Rupert Murdoch has dropped his bid to buy the 60% of it that he doesn't already own, he does actually control it. His 39% stake is a controlling stake, a bit like his 12% stake in News Corp is a controlling stake. He's quite good at buying minority controlling stakes or amassing minority controlling stakes in various media companies. So if he were to buy the rest of B-Sky-B, nothing much would actually change in terms of the company itself. The only thing that would change is that the profits would go to News Corp rather than to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, it was opposed by other British companies, newspaper companies, that is. I think principally because I think they were very afraid of the sort of cross-subsidy and cross-promotional opportunities that owning all of Sky would afford Rupert in terms of his newspapers and promoting them. I think that was one of the main reasons. Which is also why the Daily Telegraph, for instance, has been very hard on David Cameron about all this. And the Telegraph, a traditional Conservative paper, the Tory Graph, as it's often known, has been hammering Cameron just as much, in some ways even more thoroughly, than The Guardian has been over his handling of all of this. In Parliament today, one of the things that Cameron wasn't quite able to escape was, he was repeatedly asked 6 or 7 times about conversations he'd had with News Corp executives and whether he'd ever discussed the B-Sky-B deal. And he kept saying, I never had any inappropriate conversations with News Corp people about the B-Sky-B. And I didn't want to know anything about it. In fact, I didn't know when announcements were going to be made pertaining to the deal. I thought it was very important that my position not be compromised on this. But of course, if he didn't have any inappropriate conversations, what is the definition of an appropriate conversation? And oddly, nobody seemed to ask him that. But on the whole, we were saying earlier, I think Cameron did quite well today. But that was one area where there was a degree of ambiguity.
Do you buy it? I mean, do you buy this idea that if Rupert Murdoch owned 100% of B-Sky-B rather than 40%, that he could somehow use that to brainwash the British population into buying the Sunday Times?
No. I mean, not given how effectively the public's brainwashed on lots of other things. No, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, what we saw yesterday was interesting, wasn't it? Because we saw this guy who's supposed to be the maker and breaker of governments, terror, the most powerful or most evil man on earth, depending on how hyperbolic you want to get. And yet, he didn't really look like that, did he? There was a sense of an old man past his prime. There was a bit of a sort of Shelley's poem Ozymandias. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, and the King of Kings, and all that, and so on. And yet, of course, eventually, the great monument to Ozymandias was swallowed up by the desert, and all empires fade, all empires crumble, and eventually, presumably, Rupert's will as well, in one sense or another. I mean, does he? What's your view of the long-term future of global multimedia enterprises such as News Corp? I mean, are they not at odds with prevailing business trends or technological trends, if you like?
Well, James Murdoch said something interesting a few weeks ago before the whole Millie Dowler thing came out, and suddenly he couldn't say anything anymore. Which is that News Corp is actually far too small. That global media companies these days are so big and so global that the only way that News Corp can survive is to grow aggressively from its current size. And I think there's actually something to that. For all that people think of Murdoch as being this sort of titan of the media world, which he is, his company is not that big and not that important globally. And one of the things that happens when you grow significantly from your current size, let's say that News Corp went from being a $40 billion company to a $140 billion company, say. At that point, there's no conceivable way that the Murdoch family could ever have control anymore.
Right. Uh-huh.
So when James was talking about the need to grow, there was this kind of subtext there, which I don't think very many people picked up on, that maybe it shouldn't be a Murdoch company anymore. Maybe it should just be a very, very large global media concern, run by professional managers like, Time Warner or Viacom or any of the other big global media companies.
But that's not the way the old man sees it, is it?
Well, I think the old man would love to have his cake and eat it. Rupert would love to grow, but only if he can retain control.
Yeah.
So, but it's hard to do.
Great white shark, doesn't do well in company.
There was this
solitary existence, but always eating.
In testimony in the News America case, where one of his key employees, who's now the CEO of News America and the publisher of the New York Post, was saying that he sits down for lunch with his competitors and he says, "I work for a man who wants it all and doesn't see why he shouldn't have it all. If you dare compete with us, we will destroy you." And this is true, and Rupert Murdoch does want it all, and I think there's limits to, and it's quite impressive, frankly, how much he has managed to amass over the past 50 years on a personal basis. His company is just, he is this multi-billionaire, and he has changed the media landscape in many, many, many countries, not just the UK, but also the US. It was inconceivable when he launched Fox as a network. There were 3 networks in the US.
It's a titanic achievement, isn't it?
And now there are 4, and Fox is by no means the smallest.
People often, in the UK, they often talk about, his impact on the UK media market and so on. And there are lots of people, particularly at the BBC and elsewhere, who think, there's something terribly vulgar about Murdoch, and he's coarsened British life and all the rest of it. And you can argue this one way or the other. And so on. I would say that he's certainly, whatever his impact on the UK, he has probably improved public life and the media in the United States. But I don't know. Would you go along with that? By breaking up an old cartel, in one sense.
He has changed it. He has revolutionized it in many ways. I think I would hesitate before saying he has improved it. I think Fox probably shook up the old 3 networks in an interestingly disruptive way. I think that Fox News, that the Roger Ailes vehicle, has been absolutely poisonous. And incredibly unhelpful.
But in one sense, yes. But is it the media's job to be helpful? Indeed, what's wrong with the media being poisonous? In one sense, Fox News, for all that it's quite ridiculous at times in its propaganda and the rest of it and so on, it is at least providing an outlet for views that weren't actually represented by the big 3 networks or by CNN previously. And, in that sense, it adds to the diversity and gaiety of the nation, doesn't it?
Diversity, perhaps. I'm not sure about the gaiety. It clearly, scratches an itch on the right-hand half of the country. And I think it does that in a way which is really very bad for civil society in the US. Now, you're absolutely right that Rupert Murdoch has no sort of obligation to enrich rather than debase US civil society. But I think most of us, certainly in the sort of bi-coastal liberal elite,
you see, there's your true colours coming out.
My true colours coming out here. As a signed-up member of the bi-coastal liberal elite, I deplore the influence of Fox News. This will, I'm sure, shock the
both
of the people who've managed to get this far in the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, the media, I always think of Mencken's, rather sour, but admittedly, view of, democracy being the theory that the people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. Television and newspapers, I think one could say something similar in some respects. The people know what they want and deserve to get lots of it. And Rupert, has always been very good at giving them that.
He has a genuinely popular touch, and what he's managed to do in sports. He's like, we need more cameras, we need higher definition. He pushes that, and he's willing to spend enormous amounts of money to create it, and that's great. It's enriched, lives. It's maximized utility, in economists speak. He's given the world The Simpsons, and that's not nothing. He's good at giving people what they want. He's very good at that, and he's good at paying lots of money to do that. And so he's made a lot of people very rich in the process.
And very happy.
And very happy.
He's destroyed plenty of lives as well, of course.
He has destroyed lives, and he has also created Fox News. And Fox News, I think, is different in many ways from the rest of those, just because it's not a happy-making media franchise. It's actually an angry-making media franchise, and that, I think, is more dangerous. He's rabble-rousing in the way that, The Simpsons is not.
But wouldn't one have more sympathy for that perspective if Fox News' competitors at CNN or MSNBC were actually news channels in the accepted definition of the term, rather than extended talk shows, just as Fox is? If CNN America, CNN International is a rather different beast, and so on, and MSNBC were actually producing something wonderful themselves, I might have more sympathy for the notion that the whole culture of cable news has been thoroughly debased by Fox, and it's impossible to compete with that except by descending to the same lowest common denominator. Has that actually been the case? Who are Fox competing with? It's not as though they've destroyed something that was magnificent and existed before them, have they?
Well, I think, cable news in general, you're right, it's not known for breaking anything, really. It's a bunch of...
Yeah, but it doesn't even have reporters, there are no sort of packages.
Yeah. Well, the reason why you don't break any news is because you don't have any reporters who are out there reporting.
Yeah.
But what it has destroyed, and I'm a little bit, on the fence about this, I'm not sure, but I think there's no doubt that the big three news networks, the ABC, NBC, CBS, the broadcast news networks, used to do more and harder-hitting, genuine reporting than they do now. And there's a case to be made that one of the reasons for that is the rise of the cable news networks, which don't do reporting. There's also a case to be made that it's got nothing to do with the cable news networks, and it's got to do with lots of, that people just rather watch reality TV or, Netflix. I don't know. It's hard to tell. But Fox News has certainly not been helpful in that front. If you get the most assiduous and avid news consumers all moving away from the news networks and to this sort of fake news on Fox, that doesn't help in terms of the audience for the big networks. But this is something I'm not by any means an expert on. All I know is that politically speaking, when I look at the rhetoric coming out of the House of Representatives right now,
you shouldn't do that. It will only upset you.
It's unutterably depressing, and it's really driven very much by Fox News. It's absolutely scary, the degree of influence that Fox News has among House Republicans, and that's not good for the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at the same time, the question of media influence is fascinating, because it's really a dance between the media, whether it's television. Television, will grant you, is more powerful than newspapers, just because of the nature of the medium and all the rest of it. But it's in the same way as, in the United Kingdom, Murdoch's signature political achievement, if you like, is keeping the UK, or helping keep the UK out of the euro. He's vehemently opposed to British membership of the the single currency.
I think we argued about the euro. The only thing he
people,
said in his testimony about what he ever talked to Tony Blair about.
But the public were already skeptical about membership of the euro before Rupert Murdoch's newspapers decided they should be skeptical about it. And it wasn't just Murdoch's papers either. I mean, the Mail Group, for instance, is perhaps even more vehemently opposed to the notion than Murdoch's papers are. So on the one hand, you have yes, you can look at headlines and say, the Murdoch press is leading public opinion, but it's also following public opinion at the same time, and it's a sort of intricate dance of
it is. I mean, Murdoch. It's a little bit like
Murdoch didn't elect
currency intervention. Like to use my to put my finance blogger hat on for a minute here. When central banks want to move their currency, you never buy up the currency to strengthen it when everybody else is selling it, because that never works. You have to go with the tide, as it were. You wait for the markets to start moving in a certain direction, and then you pile in and really start getting the momentum going. And Murdoch is like that. He has his finger on the sort of national pulse enough that he knows where the mood of the country is heading, and then he can help to steer that mood in certain directions. But certainly, when he switched his allegiance from the Tories to Labour, when Tony Blair came along, that was in response to the fact that he knew that was what the country was doing, and his job is to give the country what it wants. That's the thing. I mean, eventually, many of the sort of criticisms and complaints about Murdoch, or indeed any other large media player of his ilk, boils down to the problem you have is actually not so much with Rupert Murdoch. It's with the people. God damn them. The people. They're so stupid sometimes.
There are so many of them. They're so stupid and. Awful. I mean, you'd never have.
They don't want. They don't even want to raise the debt ceiling. I mean, they're crazy.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, Murdoch's, terribleness is if you like, just simply that he allows people, he allows, if you like, the liberal bicoastal elite to see what quote real America is thinking. Which is often preposterous, but that's a different matter entirely. I
think that's
I love Conrad Black's description of Murdoch. Like Napoleon, a great bad man. And that's probably about it, actually, in some ways.
And great in years as well. The man is 80 now, and he looked like he was nodding off there a couple of times in testimony yesterday.
I
think
but there's still some blood left in the old man, I think.
There is blood left in the old man, and he certainly banged his table with a certain amount of vehemence, but I feel that this is the twilight. Jack Schaefer actually called it Götterdämmerung. This is the final great act of Rupert Murdoch's personal career was buying the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones for $5 billion. He will never pull another personal stunt like that. And from then on in, it's basically all been downhill. And the questions now are all about succession. It's not what will Rupert do next. It's like, when will Rupert finally leave and be replaced by either Chase Carey or James or Elizabeth or someone else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the English-speaking world, there are relatively few worlds left for him to conquer. He can't buy any more newspapers in Britain.
There was lots of talk.
He can't really buy any more in the United States either.
There was lots of talk when the News of the World closed that it was the largest English-language newspaper. It had the largest circulation of any English-language newspaper in the world. Which it may or may not be true, but the only other pretender to that crown and the undisputed holder of that crown right now is the Times of India.
Yes. I mean, India would be the obvious or the logical place for him to expand, I suppose, wouldn't it?
Yes, but I think he's much more interested in China, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, he's been in China for a long time now.
Very successfully.
And China, his operations in China are a reminder that, he's a businessman first, a newspaperman second, and an ideologue third. He's quite happy to sacrifice large parts of what he really believes in terms of his, if you like, his ideal political agenda for his business interests. And his experience in China.
In both ways, I think, Frank. I mean, there's credible reason to believe that he is actually personally significantly to the left of Fox News, and then he puts up with Fox News's crazy wingnut agenda because it makes money.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think that Roger Ailes should probably be a little careful. He doesn't want to get too big for his boots. Otherwise, Murdoch has disposed of plenty of people like Roger Ailes in the past. But as you say, as long as Fox remains a cash cow, then Ailes is probably safe as well. But that's a different matter as well.
It is, but I think the future of News Corp is probably cloudier now than it has been in a long time, and there's a lot of volatility here. There's a lot of what we finance geeks would call tail risk. With all of these different reports coming out, virtually anything can happen.
There could be a landmine or an IED.
Exactly.
Anywhere.
Do you have any visibility on when these reports are likely to come out and when the IEDs might explode, if there are any?
Sometime in the autumn or the fall, as I suppose one should say. October, I think, is perhaps when they would like some of them to start reporting back, but they won't all be completed by then, I imagine. And the aftershocks, if you like, of this affair will rumble for a fair bit, even if most people in the Westminster Fleet Street village would quite like eventually to draw a line under it and just sort of say, well, okay, mistakes were made, we'll try and avoid
Nick Davies
isn't
going to allow that to happen, is he? I mean, he's not. He's got his bone now. He's going to continue. He's been gnawing it for 2 years. He's not going to stop.
No, that's true. But eventually, a lot of it, the public have priced in a lot of it. I think they didn't have a very high opinion of journalists in the first place. And as it turned out, they were quite right not to have a high opinion of journalists. But that's also been the case for at least 70 or 80 years. There's the line in Decline and Fall where Evelyn Waugh's writing about the Fleet Street tax and so on, and they've all given terrible names like Shumbo and so on, and many they had loitered on many a doorstep and forced entry into many a stricken home. This sort of stuff has been going on for a long time, one way or another. The technologies may have changed, but the essential attitudes and behaviour of the press is rather more consistent over the years and decades than people sometimes imagine. It wasn't just Rupert Murdoch who introduced this stuff into the UK press, it's just the way it's been. But people can't pretend they don't know anymore.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And
yeah. 'Twas ever thus and all that.
And so on which note, I think we will resignedly say that whatever happens to Rupert Murdoch, the press will be the press. The UK public will hate journalists with reasonably good reason, and who knows? Maybe they're going to they'll look back in future years on the Australian billionaire media mogul and with a tinge of what's the word, nostalgia in comparison to their Russian billionaire media moguls who've replaced them.
Exactly. He may be a dreadful old brute, or as Jack Schaefer calls him, a genocidal tyrant, but he may be better than what follows.
All right, Alex, thank you very much. It's been enlightening.
Thank you, Felix. Good fun.
All right, cheers.
Cheers.